Have you ever had an evaluation committee defer to one person who's an expert in the room? Or worse yet, not understand the requirements so they give everybody the exact same score? This week, let's explore how to get to contract the most effective and efficient way through an evaluation committee and avoid the issues with lack of clarity, inadequate representation, or bias. Hello again, my friends. Welcome. My name is Catherine Corin, and I'll be your procurement guide. I provide tips and tricks on the practical steps in the procurement process for public sector in Canada. This week, we're going to talk about evaluation committees and how to form a committee that are the correct people for what you need. Now, previous videos, hopefully you are forming this committee when you are building your requirements. And so they are very well informed in what the requirements are, how you're going to evaluate, and they're informing the process. So there aren't any surprises at the evaluation stage. We should have a mix of evaluators from various departments, various stakeholders, but please, 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 please do not make it more than 5 people. There is a study that we referenced way back in the early 2000s about group dynamics. And this is not just for evaluation committees, but it's also on decision making and how to come to a consensus business decision. The more people involved in the group, the more social interactions that have to occur. And the more communication, the more it bogs down the process. So one of the best practices, make your evaluation committee between 3 to 5 people. I've had committees go higher, but then you are tacking on more time to your evaluation process. And in my experience, most people want these done very quickly. Your evaluators should be a mix of subject matter experts. As I mentioned, you want your stakeholders. Hopefully you've done it before. But the caveat being you don't want to have any reporting relationship. So should not have a supervisor and a staff member both on the evaluation committee because it gives the perception of influence. So let's just, and again, if you have someone like a VP and some of their staff, it can give that perception that people are afraid to speak up. So we have to be very careful in how we pick our diverse group, but still make sure that we have adequate representation from the correct stakeholders. So some of the stakeholders, depending on the RFP process that we're doing, we'd be looking at IT if it's an IT project, obviously. They'll be the technical experts. They have to support the IT platform or interactions. So they would be obviously included on those. Administrative, depending on, again, what you're buying, service, good. Sometimes finance people are really good to be in the process in terms of how the financial process is going to go, or if you have to do a financial modeling exercise or a financial viability exercise. They don't necessarily have to be part of the core evaluation team, but they should definitely be involved on those complex financial models or financial viability or total cost of ownership calculations. Now, when it comes to some of the technical evaluations, like if we're buying some highly technical equipment or again, information technology, some people may feel, okay, it's too technical for me to evaluate. However, it depends on what you're buying and how heavily weighted the evaluation and requirements are on the technical side, because there's always some of this other side to it, not just the technical specifications, but also the support and the operations and the user interfaces. All those types of things can be evaluated by end users, administrative staff. So if you have something that is highly, highly technical, you could portion that off into a separate evaluation, but that'll be a topic for another time. Obviously, if you have some evaluators that are reluctant because they think what we're buying is too technical for them, have them participate in some of the discussions to understand what the business need is, what the outcomes are meant to be, and maybe the technical piece is going to be something done separately, in which case they don't need to know or be subject matter expert on technical. Kind of leading from that diverse group and people being reluctant to participate is availability. And that is a key component for the evaluation. You need the same people from start to finish on each and every single proposal. In order for all vendors to be treated fairly, they have to have the same evaluators start to finish. They can't have someone drop in the middle. That vendors ABC were evaluated by one person and DEF got evaluated by a different person. It needs to be the same people start to finish. But again, if you've built your evaluation and RFP with a committee at the beginning before posting, you will have had that lead time to block their calendars. If not, then you've come to, like, the RFP's posted. Really, you need to know who your evaluators are before closing, way before closing, because they need to be familiar with the RFP document and familiar with it before you get them into kickoff and understanding how to evaluate. You also need to block their calendars. And that's a huge tip, is that you're going to block their calendars for a kickoff meeting before the RFP closes, answer questions, deal with any potential issues. You're going to get the conflict of interest declarations signed off. Then you're going to give them proposals and recommend that they block their calendars to give sufficient time to do their individual evaluations. And then you're also blocking their calendars for when consensus would be occurring. You should have a whole schedule laid out, start to finish, of your RFP process, and then it adjusts if something takes longer than expected, you extend a closing date, etc. So you should be able to block their calendars, and they should know their availability when you've posted that RFP in advance. If perhaps, though, even in advance, you've blocked these people's calendars, someone gets sick. So you have to weigh, okay, how long will they be unavailable, and do I need to replace them? So sometimes you want to have a backup person who, again, is familiar with the RFP, and then the backup person takes over. It's not that they are the backup for this day, because you need the same people start to finish. They will take over. Training your evaluation committee. I've mentioned the kickoff meeting. That kickoff meeting is where you're going to explain to them the evaluation process, just high level of how the evaluation booklet works, the requirements, all communications that they go through, the procurement contact. No one is supposed to contact vendors directly. You give them tips on how to evaluate, answer any questions, and it should alleviate some of their angst and some of the issues of going through. Over time, you gain experience, and I usually tell people, read through a proposal first and then go back and score. Your first one's always going to take the longest because you're getting familiar with the evaluation booklet and proposal layouts. You want your evaluators to randomly choose which one they do first, because it's unfair if everybody picks the same guy first and it's the hardest one to evaluate. After you do that kickoff, send them a tip sheet of what was discussed so that they have a reference point to help them go through the process. Conflicts of interest, I mentioned earlier that you're having them sign off on a conflict of interest declaration. That is not just if they have part ownership in a company, it's if they have any family friend relationship with people who work in the organization, a former boss working there. I will do another video on conflict of interest, but I have had these questions come up. And if it's not necessarily that there is a conflict of interest, but if there's a potential to have a perception of that, an unsuccessful vendor will think, well, that person was biased for this company, or someone might think they were biased against them because they knew them. Depends on the business relationship. So that's why we do a conflict of interest declaration. I have a story that I will give in that future video about someone who there was a process that was done that they did not have those signed off. And it wasn't until the last proposal that someone actually put their hand up and said, I have to recuse myself from this evaluation. And observers in evaluations. This is a nightmare. It keeps coming up. And I would ask why. Why does someone feel the need to observe an evaluation? It's fine if it's for training purposes. You have new staff and you want to teach them how the process works. You want them to come in and observe how it's done. I've had a procurement clerk come into an evaluation, but they were actually put to work to keep notes. They were learning during the process. They weren't just sitting there observing, they were taking notes. They had a purpose, they had a role, and then they could learn the process. I've had executive team members and stakeholders want to observe the evaluation. And the question is why? And most times is like, well, I want to make sure that they're doing it correctly. That sounds to me like you're trying to influence the evaluators, and they themselves are going to feel that way as well. They're not necessarily going to speak openly if you are going to comment about how they're evaluating. They are not being evaluated. They are not there for you to oversee what they're doing. So I would argue against executive members wanting to observe an evaluation, and for what purpose. I've had this come up before, and in the discussion, I pointed out that the executive were part of the stakeholder steering committee in developing the requirements throughout the process. They oversaw what the committee created as requirements, what we put into the RFP, what we put into the evaluation booklet. And they also oversaw who was participating in the evaluation committee. So they had their influence in the process, but then they needed to let go and trust the process and trust the people they put forth and the requirements would flesh out the best decision. Otherwise, then they should be evaluating themselves. And I know a lot of people can't have those kinds of conversations with executive members. So I would ask the question and then take it to your supervisor or your supervisor's supervisor or your supervisor's supervisor, etc. Take it to a level where someone else can have that common sense discussion with the executive team members, because I understand not everybody has that ability to speak candidly with an executive team member. So I just want to kind of teach what the concern and issue is so you make a well-informed decision, but knowing you can't have that candid discussion, make the point of finding out what the problem is they think they're going to solve by observing, identify the pros and cons, risks, consequences, and then escalate it through the appropriate channels as best you can. If for whatever reason you're going to have observers in your evaluation, they also need to sign a conflict of interest declaration, and you need to set some parameters and roles and responsibilities about what they can and cannot say in that evaluation in order to maintain the open, fair, and transparent, free from bias, free from influence evaluation committee meetings. Anyways, I hope this is helpful in building an evaluation committee and rules of conduct on a high level. Drop a note below if you have other questions or want to hear about other topics of how to handle different situations. And thanks for watching, and see you next week.